So now we're going to change the pace up a little bit. We're going to have a panel on blockchain. I'd like to introduce the moderator, Kevin Jackson, CEO of CG Globalnet.
So thank you very much for the introduction and that have me on this panel. I'll tell you, blockchain is something that's trying to take over the world. Before this year, the only thing anyone ever heard of blockchain was Bitcoin, and how all of the bad people in the world use Bitcoin to scam everyone else. But now we're here to learn how you can use it. So I'm going to be welcoming this panel. Really is well versed in things that are going on, because in 2021 we really saw a rise of smart contracts. The name of the panel is just about security on these smart contracts, security and privacy. And in 2021 we saw this tremendous rise in the use of smart contracts as the primary application for decentralized finance. And what crook doesn't want to get into your finances? And this change really dramatically raised the concerns regarding the security of the blockchain infrastructure. The DeFi losses were astonishing. You can trace them back to the DAO breach, where $50 million, a small sum was lost. But more recent episodes include a liquid breach, a Japanese company of $97 million. And there was 2 separate breaches with Cream. They didn't learn anything after their $37.5 million breach. Then they had a second in the same year. This year, $29 million. And then the mother of all breaches, $600 million breach in Poly Network. So this session will really delve into the security around smart contracts and how to fix this problem, and how to do it without affecting performance of this technology. The panelists will also address possible technical, social, and operational root causes of this issue. I had a pleasure of actually interviewing both Professor Laska on the blockchain trilemma and the future, and Dr. Matsuo. He schooled me on blockchain for business trust. Next on my list, but first on the panel, is Professor Eric Berger from Georgetown. Please come join me on stage.
Thank you very much.
So each of the panelists, I'm going to ask them to maybe introduce yourself and tell us how to solve this problem.
Absolutely, thanks. And in introducing myself, you'll notice I'm the person with shoes on and a tie on. So yes, 35 years ago, I lived about 4 blocks that way and turned around a Silicon Valley company. But yes, I've been in DC for quite a while now. After being CTO of a number of network equipment and enterprise software companies, I landed at Georgetown University. And then being in DC, I got kind of sucked into the federal government, where I served as the CTO of the FCC, and then later as the Assistant Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So I approach things with a science background, I do have to use that PhD somehow.
Good thing.
But also, looking at like policy and law. And when we talk about smart contracts, to be an interesting smart contract, they tend to have to deal with things from the real world. And so I'm working on a very small problem called, what is truth? How do we get events and information from the real world onto the blockchain? Now we could say, like with Bitcoin, well, we know what truth is. Like we know what people's balances are within an understanding of statistical validity, because there's the possibility of a 51% attack, which we did see with like Bitcoin Cash. So it's not impossible, but with a very large network, very difficult. But I wouldn't call that an interesting problem because your balance in Bitcoin is created on the ledger. There's no bringing on of information from the outside. Now, I can't say that I'm the first person to be thinking about this. Actually, Plato, in relating Socrates,
They had Bitcoin back then?
they didn't have Bitcoin, but they did have the problem of truth. And so the easy problems of bringing truth into a ledger have been attacked. These are things like, I want to know the result of a sports score. And it's kind of a funny use case, but I'm using the smart contract for gambling. But people still, you need to have, who won the World Cup. And the way that tends to be done is, oh, well, we'll agree to use whatever ESPN says. Or we have the outcome of like an insurance event. Did a storm happen? Was the house destroyed? But also more of interest in some work that we have going on is on, well, did you properly do all the things you said you would do to protect your house, and in particular, we're looking in the cyber realm. Have you applied all of your patches? So we're looking at like the answerable questions and ways of using game theory and economics to get people to basically tell us the truth.
Wow, I tell you, I've had this problem ever since my first child. How do you know the truth?
Right.
And you're working on it too. Well, the next panelist has been working on it too. So I'd like to invite to the stage Professor Aaron Laska from University of Houston. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Hey, Aaron,
joining
good
us.
to see you again.
So Professor Berger is is working on how to figure out the truth. So you introduce yourself and tell us what you're working on with respect to smart contracts.
Thank you. Just like Eric, I actually also have a history in the Bay Area. Back in 2015, 2016, I was at UC Berkeley, so not that long ago. And then I joined Vanderbilt, and currently I'm a faculty member at the University of Houston. And I have actually been working on blockchain security since around 2013. So I have gained a fair bit of experience. And in my opening statement, I would like to give you my thoughts on why smart contract security is interesting and why do we even need to talk about this in the first place? Because we have been researching cybersecurity for traditional IT systems for decades. How are smart contracts secure? And I believe there are a number of unique characteristics that make smart contracts very different and their security very different from that of traditional IT systems. And one key factor is immutability, which is of course the big advantage of blockchains. Once you record something, nobody can change it. But it also means that if there's a cyber attack and there's a malicious transaction, you cannot take it back. And it is something that's fundamentally different from traditional IT systems. Consider, for example, the 2016 cyber attack against the Bangladeshi Central Bank, in which almost $1 billion worth of malicious transfers were executed. But fortunately, most of those transactions were actually blocked because there were humans in the system who got suspicious. And even the transactions that were not blocked, those were recovered mostly. Now, in contrast to that, with decentralized finance, with blockchains, you have a very different situation. You mentioned the famous DAO attack. In that case, it was impossible to recover the funds because in blockchains, the software code is the law. There is no fail-safe. And in that sense, I think that smart contract security is actually more like the security of critical systems. Think like avionics, automotive industry, and medical devices. And we have been thinking about smart contracts similar to traditional IT systems used in finance, but I believe that we should rather be thinking about them as critical systems, like embedded systems, and try to adopt methodology and techniques like verification, model-driven design from those fields. And there are, of course, other important differences. For instance, the fact that everything on the blockchain is public, which is, again, a key advantage, but it is a weakness because everything is public, which means that the software code is public and the data is public. So you don't have any kind of confidentiality by default. And of course, you can draw parallels to, for example, open source software, where again, you have the software code available to everyone, but there is really no parallel to systems where all the data is inherently public. So I believe that security of smart contract is a very interesting topic because it's really unlike other problems, other security problems in traditional IT systems. And I'm really happy that, to be on this panel and to talk a little bit more about how those changes could be solved.
Oh, thank you, because I really want to delve into that. That Bangladeshi incident is kind of weird because when we're talking about security, it seems to always be about taking people out of the process to make it more secure. And in this particular case, it seemed like it was the people that stopped it. So maybe people are good after all. But I'm going to bring the third panelist up to tell us what he thinks about security on the smart contracts. Dr. Shinichiro Matsuru, the head of blockchain at NTT Research. Thank you very much. So we have somebody working on the truth, somebody bringing people back into security, which in and of itself is weird. So what are you going to surprise us with?
Okay, anyway, so I need to introduce myself.
Yes,
Okay.
please do.
I'm Shinichiro Matsuo. I'm a senior scientist at NTT Research and head of blockchain research group here. And in Paris, I worked at Georgetown University with Eric Berger on the blockchain research. And to introduce myself for the first, so I almost the first my professional job in the cryptographic research in designing e-cash system in Japan. So in late 90s, that NTT and Bank of Japan created that some central bank digital currency at that moment. This is the first era of the digital cash, central bank digital cash. And I engaged in that, designing protocols, implementation of that protocol itself, and doing some experiment at that time. So this is my first career and my first professional job in designing application of cryptography. And for the security of the blockchain, so I would like to raise that issue that, so we need to do the factoring of the source of issues, because that, so of course that, so as Aaron said, so mechanism of the smart contract might have some error bugs to have some issues, but we have several different types of sources of problem. For example, underlying cryptography, for example, I don't think that it happened in the near future, but quantum computers might break that some modern cryptography. Mm-hmm. It is the source of the problem for blockchain for long-range issues. And of course, we need to have the secure design of protocols of the consensus algorithms, basic blockchain protocols. And of course, we need to create a secure application logic like a smart contract. This is one of the expertise of Aaron Atsuka. And we need to implement that logic securely in the software and hardware in the wallet or something. And operation is another thing. So key management is the main topic for the security of blockchain. And I would like to follow that discussion by Aaron. That governance among the stakeholders is another issue because that currently, United States regulators think about how to regulate the DeFi or smart contract itself. So we need to know that what the regulators would like to ask us for the design of the technology. So we need to include all stakeholders to design secure cryptography to the secure governance of. So we have the 6 or 7 different types of aspects we need to think about that security or privacy of the blockchain technology.
Wow. You scare me, Doctor. I mean, we came up here to talk about security and privacy, and you've listed like 6 of them. So I think I want to go back to Professor Berger. I mean, what is the key issue in blockchain security and privacy? It seemed like you had it all figured out. It was, what is the truth?
Well, we're working on that. As many people know, I mean, and there are like objective measures of truth, but even then some people might not believe in what most people would objectively say is the truth. So that's not quite solved. But I think it is important, especially with what Professor Dr. Matsuo mentioned about governance, that in a sense, just because something is on a distributed ledger doesn't make it different. Although, as Aaron said, it does make it different. So things like immutability is different. And if you're raising money for a Ponzi scheme, that's still fraud. If you are attacking like the Dao to extract funds out, that's still, actually that's a shady part of the law. But if you are using a digital currency to take more than $10,000 outside or bring it into the US, or to change value gained without paying taxes or through illegal means, we call this money laundering, that is still illegal, whether it's on a blockchain or not. And I think people are starting to realize, both the criminals, but also in government, policymakers are realizing that this is an area of policy work, policy research to bring things in. Of course, what's different, as we're here at the NTT research,
Right.
Japan has the luxury of having one agency that does all that. We've got like 6. And 2 of them or 3 of them are independent agencies, so they don't even get to be told what to do. They get to do whatever they want. So it makes it kind of challenging in our environment to make you sleep even a little bit less.
So, Professor Laska, I know that you've done a lot of research on the earlier DAO breach. That was, well, people believe, I guess, you can clarify this, but that was a software issue. So, some coder out there screwed up, essentially. So, is the issue around blockchain security as simple as giving your coder the right pizza?
Well, I wish it was that simple. I think it's actually very challenging because of how different blockchain systems are. And I think we have come a long way. The situation is much, much better than it was, let's say, back in 2016 when the Dao Attack happened. There's been significant progress in languages, in design practices, and in general the quality of the code, the software code that's out there. But still, there are issues. You mentioned attacks against Stream Finance, which were, again, based on exploiting software vulnerabilities. Somebody simply made a very expensive mistake when they were developing the code. But there are other attacks as well. For example, there was another attack against the Poly network, which, if I remember correctly, cost around $600 million. And again, this was a software vulnerability. So we have come a long way, but there are still a lot of issues to be addressed in that respect. And I think we cannot expect people to write perfect code. That will never happen. So I think we have to look at how to help people develop more secure code by doing verification, model-driven design, and so on. And I think for that, we can look into what, for example, the avionics industry has been doing. For airplanes, we have much, much stricter standards for developing code than we have for traditional IT systems. We should be relying on those standards. We should aim at the same level of reliability. But I also think that there are other aspects, not just software security, but as Eric mentioned, legal aspects. And there are some fundamental challenges that blockchains pose, for example, to privacy. For instance, the EU's privacy regulation, the GDPR, it gives users the right to be forgotten. It gives users the right to delete data pertaining to them. Now with blockchains, that becomes extremely difficult because one of the key features of blockchains is immutability.
Okay.
Once you record something, nobody can alter it. And that's a big advantage. Nobody can tamper with the data. But it also means that once you put your data on the blockchain, it remains there until the end of time. So how can you satisfy the requirements of GDPR and provide privacy while using blockchains? And these are fundamental challenges which will require further research.
So I know many people have heard about the chicken and egg problem, but this seems like that type of problem when it comes to governance and laws, because laws and governance reflect what society feels at that particular point of time. And as we know, society changes its mind. So Dr. Matsuo, I know you've done a lot of work when it comes to governance. So how do you create an effective governance over data that never changes?
Okay, currently, so I'm facing that fundamental problem among stakeholders. So we need to consider many different types of stakeholders, like engineers, researchers, business entities, consumers or investors, of course, so governmental regulators. So we have that, so several different types of stakeholders in this ecosystem first. Right. But the main problem is we don't have any common language to understand the problem or understand the ecosystem is. For example, the definition of DeFi, DEFI, this is some kind of marketing word at this moment. And so there are many different types of understanding. So when we hear that word of DeFi, right. Blockchain is the same thing. So we need to define that common language to have some healthy and productive conversation between stakeholders. This is the first problem we need to solve. And the other is, so we need to have some neutral discussion. So let us consider the history of the internet technology. I think that Eric has much experience about that. But in the internet technology, development of the internet technology started in 1960s, I think. And so based on the academic network in the United States. And but in the case, of course, that the internet, the commercialization of the internet was happened in early 90s. I think this is a history. So we spent 25 or 30 years from the start of the internet technology development to the commercialization of the internet technology. But in the case of Bitcoin and blockchain or smart contract, the Satoshi's paper was published in 2008. And the programming code was published in 2009, and the business entity started their business before the confirmation by academia, neutral academia. So we need to have that some neutral and academic discussion to have to figure that if that programming code is safe for society or safe for us. So that kind of neutral platform is needed.
Okay, sort of that academic middle road so that people can understand and agree on definitions, what's right, what's wrong, what's good.
Yeah.
Sounds like a commercial for NTT research, doesn't it?
Yeah, but this is what NTT research is expected from the stakeholders of blockchain, that we are doing that basic, very fundamental research.
Right.
So we contributed many papers to academia. So this is a source of neutral discussion for all stakeholders.
Oh, that's excellent. But there's a lot of issues that have to be addressed for this. And Professor Laska, I want to sort of ask you, is this challenge when it comes to the security and privacy of smart contracts, is it really a technical challenge or operational, as Dr. Matsuo was? We don't have enough good people or the standardizations around blockchain, or is it really social because, as Professor Berger says, we don't know the truth? So which is it?
I'm afraid all of the above. There are definitely technical challenges that we can address with technical solutions, but there are, of course, social challenges. There's a lot of misconception about what blockchains provide, especially if you think about end users. They have a lot of misconceptions about, for example, confidentiality, privacy, anonymity. A lot of people think that just because something is on blockchains, it's immediately anonymous, but that is completely untrue. It's pseudonymous. And we're talking about the legal aspects as well. Those also need to be synchronized, and that's, again, a social issue. For instance, in recent years, so-called NFTs, non-fungible tokens, have become increasingly popular for trading digital arts. But those don't really conform to our existing copyright laws, which are supposed to do the exact same thing, allow you to transfer the ownership of, for example, an art product. So I think there is a range of problems, technical, social, legal.
Wow. So, Dr. Matsuo, which is first? What do we tackle first?
I'm sorry that that's the same answer as Lalong. There's no first thing that, so we need to solve this problem from all aspects at the same time. So there's also a problem of this chaos situation.
Chaos, okay.
Is yeah, you know that. I think that currently that the engineers, this is not PhD student or PhD, they don't hold the PhD, but they are a community of engineers. For Bitcoin Core is a community of engineers. They are creating that new software called Everyday. And they became the one important player to establish order of finance at this moment. So ordinarily so in the past, so the order of finance is created by government and huge banks.
Right.
So they're the creator of that orders. But at this moment, that this kind of engineers, group of engineers, is a part of creator order of finance. And this is the reason why I say that so we need to have some common ground to have conversation among engineers and government people. So this is what I'm doing at the beginning, BGIN. So this is a similar kind of organization like IETF for the internet. And we have same playground for all stakeholders
Right.
to talk about that. So usually that Bitcoin Core, this is a part of cypherpunk. And they do not want to talk with government person. And in some cases, they hate government person.
Yeah.
But so surprisingly, there are several Bitcoin Core engineers joined that discussion with government people to fight against, for example, ransomware reaction or something. So this is a good starting point to have to create that new types of governance by all stakeholders.
To try to get everyone together, the actual talk about how to make this better. So, Professor Berger, I want to come back to a statement you made earlier. We're all talking about how blockchain can support the real world, but we haven't figured out how to get information and data from the real world onto the blockchain in a way that we can really trust it. I guess they call it, the ingestion of this off-chain data. It's called the Oracle problem. And I understand you have some expertise in that.
Yeah, and again, this all goes back to, it's only 2,400 years old. And although actually I would like to touch upon a little bit about, like the governance and the technology, and then I'll get to that. And that is, like the chicken or the egg, and the answer is actually yes, coevolution. The technology that we see in Bitcoin comes from academic research, a lot done at like Microsoft Research in 1992, so quite a while back. And then it kind of got out there. And this gets to kind of an important, in the United States, we know that innovation drives the economy. So we really don't want to do things that'll inhibit innovation. So for example, licensing software engineers to write open source distributed ledger stuff because no one knows what it is, we probably wouldn't have wanted to do that in 2008 because we would never see Bitcoin, which was basically the thing that popularized. By the way, governments, most famously the Estonian government, used something that today we would call blockchain, although they wouldn't have called it when they did it in 2001. And that was to a very specific use case, to protect themselves against what would happen when they are invaded, which they still expect to happen. So a very different use case than other countries have. And so we see this kind of pendulum going back and forth, kind of the Wild West, where really first, so like the academic research, someone gets a wild and crazy idea, they write a paper that nobody reads for 20 years. And then it gets discovered again. They don't discover the paper. Someone says, hey, I've invented this thing called the blockchain. Well, actually it was done by Microsoft 15 years earlier. But they didn't know that. But they build it on, and then the academics can come in and study it and analyze it and say, well, actually, you repeated these mistakes that we know about. Why don't you do it this way? Governments get in and say, like, yes, when I got my pilot's license, I had cooler avionics in my itty-bitty little four-seater than was in a 737 at that time because it was different regulations. Yes, today you get better stuff in the big things, but in those days you didn't because the rules were different, and for good reason. There's only
government takes time.
Right, government takes time, and there are only 2 people in the little plane, and there's 200 people in the big plane. And so again, it's kind of like an appropriate application of regulation. And this is a thing, how do you regulate ideas? Because that's what software is an embodiment of ideas. And can we even have the thought police of, well, no, you're not allowed to write that code because you really don't know what you're doing, and even though it's like a cool idea, we don't trust you to write it.
Right.
Versus a bank who buys this stuff, and you better hope. And this is, again, where policy comes into play, where we say, well, you know what? We won't license engineers, but we'll tell the bank that they're liable for their losses. So what's the bank going to do? Their vendors are going to say, well, you're liable if your stuff has bugs in it or whatever. And those guys are going to go, well, you know what? We're going to do some formal verification of our stuff before we let it out. And in a sense, and we see this in boards, we call it technology debt. Not having appropriate cyber controls if you're not in like the software business, or not having the appropriate development controls. Right now, it's not on the books. Nobody's asking for it. It's not a thing.
There.
But if you can account for that, and we're working on ways for accounting for that, then all of a sudden, I've got a $100 million liability because I'm not doing formal verification. I'm not doing good requirements analysis. And by doing that, that will erase that debt. Well, Wall Street has an answer. Oh, you got $100 million of technology debt, and your PE's, 30. That's $3 billion worth of market cap. Poof. Gone. So that's, so now I'm sorry for that, Rand. What was the question?
No. No, it was really good because you're talking about the importance of governance and the balance. And it reminds me of the big battle when the internet came on. The internet was created by academics, and then the big bad capitalists wanted to take over. And they said, no money on the internet. We're supposed to keep it for purity. But now a similar thing is running with blockchain. I mean, we want to put reality on blockchain by bringing information from the real world, but then you spoil the immutability of the blockchain because you now have reality seeping in. So how do you address that?
Yeah, and that's actually, if you got the answer, and that's just it, is the realization and the humility of working on something that's been not really solved for 2,400 years, is it basically says, the broad thing of how do we bring it in? Well, I can actually prove we can't. So does that mean we go home? No, it means, well, and again, the difference between academic and sort of like corporate R&D. Corporate R&D is, well, I think we can answer this, so let's just build a business around it, and then we have a Dow thing. It's like, oops, we made a mistake. Whereas from the academic perspective, we care about things like proofs. And so one of the things we're working on is being able to succinctly define the kinds of things that we can bring onto a blockchain. And basically, then you do have confidence. If I bring that in, it's something that's going to be provably, and sometimes provably is provably to statistically important significance. It's like, yeah, we still know, we can prove that you can't know, and that was Plato's thing.
Yeah.
You can prove you don't know anything. Well, that's not really useful. So how can we make it useful? And that's a lot of the work we're working on.
Sounds like risk management to me.
Yes.
Right. And Dr. Matua, you're shaking your head.
Yeah.
So,
I hope you're shaking it this way, not this way. That's right.
And when you think about risk management in the financial industry, that's governance. It sort of gets back to what you were talking about, the lack of standards, the lack of trained engineers, a common understanding of blockchain and smart contracts. How does that relate to the Oracle problem?
Oracle problem? Yeah, I think that it's a better to ask Eric or to this problem.
Yeah, I'll catch. I'll finally answer the question you tried to get me to answer.
Yeah,
So I was there in the 1980s and 1990s. So Google me and IETF, and you'll see a bunch of RFCs that I've written. And it wasn't just that, the bad capitalists came in and ruined our nice academic internet, because actually then I was one of the evil capitalists. It was that it expanded the pot. It said, this is for real. It's not just an experiment. And what did work for the internet, and we did have a counterexample, which is the International Telecommunications Union, which is a treaty organization. It's a UN treaty organization that's about 100 years older than the United Nations. Agreements amongst governments, and what they say literally is law. The governments say we'll sign up for doing what the ITU says. And the IETF, in fact, in a sense, this did change about 10 years ago, but it was not real. There was no legal entity called the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. And in the early 90s, that was one of the functions of the Internet Society, which is real. It's a registered 501c3, and it was like the administrative home, the legal home for the IETF. And basically, the IETF, everything was voluntary standards. There was no, we call it, there's no protocol police. We would come up with like the best way we could figure out that's practical because in fact, now 40 years later, we're like, oops, there are some bugs there that keep getting fixed. But the best way that's practical for how to have basically computers and applications talk to each other. And in a sense, it's like a company that's competing against open source. You're competing against free, so you'd better be adding value. And the same thing with the IETF. We couldn't make anybody do it. So the protocols themselves had to be the best that's out there. And how did we do that? Industry, academia, governments, all getting together in this, what we call the multi-stakeholder model.
Okay, and I would like to follow that discussion by Eric. So one good example is the TLS, Transport Layer Security. So in 2009 or 10 or 11, so SSL and TLS has much vulnerability in the design of the protocol itself and its implementation. At that moment, the group of engineers lives in this area like a Mozilla or something, are trying to fix that problem. This is an IETF standard for secure communication, but there are many problems, and the formal analysis find that many problems on the TLS and SSL protocol. At that moment, we tried to create a new version of TLS 1.3, with group of academia, engineers, and some of the government personnel, including NIST, to create that secure protocol by involving that process of formal verification. So this is a success story to design the secure protocol and program software code. And I think that we need to utilize a similar kind of process for blockchain and smart contract mechanisms. So one of the headaches is, so every day that software engineer creating new software, but there's no document on the specification, on the design. So it's a headache for researcher like Aaron to have to conduct formal verification on that process protocol itself. And if we can ask that engineer to write up some good technical document for analysis, that will help for us to assure that level of security of each protocol and the implementation.
Well, that brings up another question that I had when it comes to blockchain. And Professor Laska, I'm going to ask you about this because Dr. Matsuro talked about having an acceptable protocol, something that everyone knows about, something that everyone has experience with and everybody trusts to use. And one thing that maybe many lay people don't understand is that one of the key technologies behind blockchain is key management, the fact that you have a public key and a private key that you have to use and leverage to make sure only the right people get the information. And that process has been embedded in the public key system that we have globally, and that we use on the internet every day. And it would seem that there's enough engineers that know enough about key management that blockchain would be just an extension of something that we know very well. So what is the role of key management in blockchain, and why doesn't something that everyone knows, PKI, help?
I think this is, again, an area where blockchains are very different. Traditional public key infrastructures rely on a trusted authority. It relies on some trusted entity that will say, this key is good, that key is not good. And that certificate authority essentially means that it's centralized. You have to rely on trusting that one entity. And the idea of blockchains is kind of the exact opposite, that I'm not going to trust one entity, I'm going to decentralize and trust the entire network. And I set up incentives so I can trust it. So I don't think that we could utilize traditional public key infrastructure to have blockchain much. What we could do is use blockchain to replace the traditional public key infrastructure, at least to some extent. One of the purposes of the traditional public infrastructure is to essentially tell people which keys they should trust, which keys they should not trust. Now, if we can use a blockchain to provide that information, instead of relying on some trusted entity, we can decentralize the public infrastructure. The solution is not trivial. There's still issues like how I verify whether a real-world entity is actually the entity that's claiming it to be. And this is where this kind of oracle comes into play, bringing the real world into blockchains. But if we can solve that problem, then we can sort of decentralize the public infrastructure. And I think that's an idea worth pursuing. And more generally, trying to replace traditional identity management and access management systems, I think that that will open up a lot of possibilities, enabling people to manage their data in a much better way.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our session, and I'd be remiss if I didn't give the audience an opportunity to ask the question if they have one. But before I go to the audience, I want to ask all of you, and I'll start with Professor Berger. What is the real role of standards in blockchain? Is there a role, or do we want to be completely decentralized and have no standards?
Yeah, well, actually, the way we are decentralized is through standards. You know, in Bitcoin, the standard is the code. You know, everyone gets a copy, they compile it, they run it, and that actually, talks to each other. And that's not exactly an open standard. Mm-hmm. And as Dr. Matsuo said, it's not, available for analysis and all that. But we do see in Ethereum and in other blockchains that are bubbling up that people are looking to do standards. And why? Because the whole point is to not be centralized, to not have one company or one entity say this is what it is, but to be able to have multiple players.
Dr. Matsuo?
Yeah, the reason why I say that standard is needed even for the decentralized technology is that decentralized technology might give damage for our society. And so this is one example is a Facebook Libra case. That the debate between that U.S. Congress and the Facebook Libra Association is the fundamental question is that mathematics can exceed the U.S. Constitution or not.
Oh, which is...
Yeah, this is a problem. This is the reason why we say that we need a conversation among stakeholders. But this is a social problem we need to solve.
A battle between the Constitution and mathematics. So who will win that? Professor Laska, what is the role of standards?
I fully agree with Eric and Shinshiro that we need standards, and I think they are even more important in a decentralized system than in a centralized one. In a centralized system, there is one authority that says this is how things work. In a decentralized system, there is no authority, so we need interoperability between the decentralized participants. And fortunately, standards are emerging. For example, we have standards for digital tokens, digital assets like the ERC20, mm-hmm. But these are emerging in a very similar way to how the IETF standards emerged. They are optional, nobody is enforcing them, but they are actively used because they help with interoperability. So things are progressing, but of course there's still a long way to go.
Great. So thank you very much for this informative and sometimes scary discussion. So we're getting the hook, but I hope this discussion has really sparked your curiosity about how we're going to make smart contracts more secure and more private. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. That was a great.
Great. Yeah.